Well, we now move to our next speaker and our last speaker before lunch. Once again, can I just thank Lairdell for sponsoring that last session. I encourage you to look at all the exhibits outside. There are some fascinating exhibits outside there. The Lairdell one, when I was walking towards it, I thought they've got tomatoes on their stand, but the closer you get, you realise they're little hearts. Anyway, our last speaker before lunch is Professor Judith Finn from the AUSROC Steering Committee. She will elaborate on the epidemiology of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest in Australia and New Zealand from the AUSROC Epistry. Judith holds an adjunct professor position at the St John Ambulance Western Australia and is currently co-chair of the St John Ambulance West Australia Advisory Group. I'm interested in a couple of the papers that you've written, Judith. One was, tell me exactly what happened when linguistic choices affect the efficiency of emergency calls. And Michael himself made reference to this issue of the effectiveness of the call, the taking of the call. And another one, you wrote a paper on awareness and influence of Australian public media, mass media campaign. And of course, Mark this morning talked about the way media can be positive or negative in helping with these issues. Would you please welcome Professor Judith Finn?
Thank you very much, Lynn. Thanks for the advertisement about some of the other work that we're doing in Western Australia in conjunction with St John Ambulance. And we certainly have branched out there with the use of a linguist that we've employed, who's actually looking at not just what's said during the dispatch call, but also how it's said. And she's actually identified some fascinating observations there, and if anyone's interested I can direct you to those papers. But today I'm talking about what's going on in the registry, the AUSROC Epistry, which we took that name from the North American Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium group, to highlight that this is a registry that we want to actually conduct epidemiological research around. So we don't just want the data to sit there and not be used. So hence what an epistry is sort of implying that it needs to be used. I'm actually the director of AUSROC, the Australian Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium, which is a collaboration amongst ambulance services and universities in Australia. So I'm presenting Ben Beck. He's the manager of the database manager of the AUSROC Epistry, and these are his slides, and any mistakes will be my misinterpretations, not Ben's slides. And there's a list there of some of the people that are involved. In the Epistry Management Committee, we have representation from each of the ambulance services involved, which is one of the strengths, I believe, of this Epistry. So AUSROC started its life as a NHMRC, a National Health and Medical Research Council Centre of Research Excellence, with the overarching aim to improve outcomes from cardiac arrest, and in particular we've focused on out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, notwithstanding our recognition of what goes on in hospitals is becoming increasingly important. We wanted to provide some infrastructure to bring together the academic organisations doing research, together with the ambulance services doing the work, and also so that we can work together to look at answering important questions. One of our main objectives right from the start was to develop a registry for Australia and New Zealand of all out-of-hospital cardiac arrests. Many of the ambulance services around Australia had been conducting or keeping registries themselves, including St John Ambulance in Western Australia. That's the oldest one, dating back to 1996. After which also, obviously, you've heard a lot about VACA, Victorian Ambulance Cardiac Arrest Registry, which is an excellent registry. And other states have come on board progressively. But the idea was that we start to share our findings within these individual registries and to look at differences, not for the sake of, waving the flag and saying, hey, we're doing better than you, but more importantly, to look at if you are getting better outcomes in a particular patient group, what are you doing that we can learn from? So it is about benchmarking, but not for the sake of benchmarking, not for the sake of developing a ranking table, but to try and learn from each other about what we can do better. So with that goal, our underlying philosophy was, as you've heard so much today, if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. Now to us that sounds so obvious, but still we've only got to look at many areas of health to know that that isn't embraced as widely as it should be. And there's a lot of supposition about what's going on, what we should do, what we could do. If you don't measure it, seriously, you're just wasting your money trying to put emphasis in areas that are not likely to impact on outcomes. So we followed particularly other innovations around the world, and in particular we looked at the North American Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium, which was a group that was based in a number of states in the US and Canada, and undertook a number of very important clinical trials, as well as the development of their epistry, which led to a number of publications. But there's other epistries around the world, or registries of multiple areas, including the European one, Eureka, that's more recent, and also Paris that's mentioned, and CARES that Mike alluded to. And the importance of this is that it's bringing together multiple individual data from individual areas and bringing it together. So why do we need this? Well, we know that there's differences in incidence and outcomes across regions. What we want to try and work out is, are these differences due to the types of patients that are having arrests? Like, are the groups of patients a lot older? Have they got greater comorbidities? Or is it about what's going on? And we believe that it's probably the what's going on, but we need to try to break down by good data as to what the various aspects of those interventions that are leading to different outcomes actually are. We need, therefore, to really try to ensure that we're comparing apples with apples. And this, even to me, and I've been doing this for a lot of years, has proved to be particularly challenging. We all say that we follow the Utstein criteria for definitions. Hey, I was on the paper that defined the Utstein criteria to learn that probably some of the definitions we were using actually weren't purest Utstein criteria. And when we looked across regions, or even within individual regions, across different players within the particular ambulance service, we found out that a lot of people had different ideas about what those definitions should mean. The other reason why an epistry, a registry, is really important is it provides baselines for, if you do implement clinical trials, it means you don't have to go out and collect all of that baseline information. It's already there to use. And obviously with OSROC, we do conduct trials. The latest one's about to start, which is the exact titration of oxygen after ROSC in cardiac arrest. So I'm really pleased to say that this is up and running. Now, there is a major gap there, but I'm very pleased to say that New South Wales now does have a cardiac arrest registry. They have been involved with us in the development of the OSROC epistry, and we are very much hoping that New South Wales Ambulance Service will be willing to contribute to the OSROC epistry in the near future. But otherwise, we're capturing the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest data from all around Australia and the whole of New Zealand. New Zealand has 2 ambulance services, St John Ambulance New Zealand and Wellington Free Ambulance Service, and so we're capturing the whole of New Zealand and hopefully soon the whole of Australia, but at the moment the captured population is getting up towards 20 million. So it's a pretty good sample size in terms of looking at what outcomes actually are. We did an original paper and looked at some of the particular characteristics of the individual state ambulance services, and I will point out we are very lucky in Australia that massive areas of Australia are managed by one ambulance service. As Mike alluded to, in the States, within an area, even in Adelaide, for example, there would be more than one ambulance service, and therefore collecting the data is much more challenging. Whereas in Australia, we have one ambulance service per state and territory. New Zealand has 2. So all in all, we don't have a lot that we have to collaborate with. However, there's still differences, and if we look at population density, you possibly can't read this, but the population density will vary even within Australia from AV, population density, persons per square kilometre is 25.68, and in Western Australia it's 1.02. So the actual population density varies. We're not a homogenous services, even though we all are ambulance services in Australia. And also, when we look at the makeup of our paramedic workforce, that's slightly different. Now, in my personal opinion, those differences are probably overestimated, but they, nonetheless, there are differences in the composition, somewhat due to the fact of the first point I made regarding population density. So we need to understand those differences, but we needed also to work on defining the characteristics that we were going to collect, because we found that we're all collecting different variables. We all had some core ones, but we all had other things that we're collecting. Sometimes looking at hospital outcomes, for example, is particularly challenging, and a couple of states within the consortium are actually finding that particularly challenging because of legislation. I mean, that is, in my opinion, pretty unfortunate. In Western Australia, for example, we actually pay for a research nurse to go and collect that information from each of the hospitals. So it's still a fairly time-consuming and difficult process to actually find out what happens to those patients after they leave hospital. We have had to try to define definitions that we thought were pretty obvious. Like if I said, okay, what does paramedic attempted resuscitation mean? I never realised that actually varied considerably across the states. Some states have a little bit of a, if the resuscitation attempt doesn't last a particular amount of time, that's not counted. Whereas other states had a belief, and New Zealand, that if you put your hands on the patient, do one chest compression, that's paramedic attempted resuscitation. So you can imagine, just with that difference of how you defined an attempted resuscitation, attempted CPR, well then that actually is going to vary a lot. It's going to be associated with patient outcomes, because if people have resuscitation withdrawn because they're found to be not for resus or an advanced care directive in place, obviously they're going to have a pretty bad outcome. So depending on what your inclusion criteria is, you can alter how good your figures actually look. So we had to try and work out how do we get these to be as similar as possible. And that's been through consensus, discussion, and the goodwill of each of the ambulance services represented to look at trying to work out how we can reach consensus. Ben has done an amazing job. Each of the individual ambulance services send their de-identified data through a secure line. I'm not too good at the technology, but it's a secure pathway into Monash University where it's collated and managed, and Ben tries to sort it all out. It's actually been really good for us because he gets back to each of us and says, you got a few inconsistent findings here, and it's been a means of internal quality control for each of us as well. So the aim was to try and describe the epidemiology. The epidemiology is essentially what are the characteristics of each of the ambulance service patients that they care for in cardiac arrest, and also what are the outcomes. So we're interested in demographics, characteristics of the arrest, and survival outcomes. So we did go with the definition of any chest compression or defib by EMS as an attempted resuscitation, and a primary outcome is survive the event, which is ROSC, on arrival at hospital. However, we recognise that from a patient-centred outcomes perspective, that survival to hospital discharge, neurological outcome are important outcomes. So each of the states is very much trying to aim towards getting those longer-term patient-centred outcomes as well. So what do we find? In our first 2015 look at the data, we had nearly 20,000 arrests. Not surprisingly, most are males. I say that because of the distribution of cardiovascular disease generally. Very important to note, most occur in the home. Has some challenges then for public access to fibrillation. Certainly doesn't mean that there's no opportunities, but we do have to recognise that a lot of arrests occur in the home. So just having a look at aggregate data of looking at number of arrests and incidents and cause between Australia and New Zealand. I'm always fascinated by the similarities. When I look at these data from various places around the world, they're pretty similar. Look at that incidence rate. I mean, can you really get much more similar than that? 99.7 per 100,000 versus 100.2. These are big numbers we're comparing, and the incidence pretty similar. The medical etiology. Now, when we say that's the new way of saying presumed cardiac etiology. That's very much presumed. Essentially, if there's no other obvious external cause, like drugs or trauma, it gets labelled as a presumed cardiac. A lot of those actually aren't cardiac, but majority still will be. So we look at who witnesses the arrest, and this is all data that's recorded at the time of the event by the paramedics. Most states are moving towards or already have electronic patient care records, which definitely assists in this process of developing registries. You can see there's a little bit of difference there in the who witnesses the arrest. Bystander CPR, Australia overall still has some way to go in bystander CPR. And shockable rhythm is an interesting finding, particularly when you see that response times aren't all that different, because when I see big differences in shockable rhythms, I automatically think, wonder what the response times were there. Response times in a future slide are pretty similar, but that's a really interesting finding. So we need to look at, and it can be tied in, I think, perhaps with the bystander CPR. Because what we record as the first initial rhythm from when the paramedics arrive may not have been the first cardiac arrest rhythm at the time of the arrest. And so, the quicker we can get hands on chest, defib on chest, the better. 48% of cases received attempted resuscitation. This is very similar to figures presented this morning for London. 34% had ROSC in the pre-hospital setting. 28% had ROSC on arrival at hospital. And as I said, the response times are, probably wouldn't be statistically significantly different. There'd be overlap there. ROSC pre-hospitals pretty similar, and ROSC at hospitals pretty similar between the two countries. So we see similarities between Australia and New Zealand in the incidence, the patient characteristics and the outcomes. We see differences in bystander CPR rates, witness status and the shockable rhythm rate. Now we need to actually do more work to try and understand what's going on here, the differences, but also we're going to be doing comparisons between ambulance services. Now, when we started talking about this some 5 years ago, there was a lot of sensitivity around by individual ambulance services as to whether they would even be willing to entertain this. I'm pleased to say that at our latest teleconference, all ambulance services have indicated that they're willing to have their figures shared at the individual level. Of course, all our publications have somebody a senior person from each ambulance service involved in that. And clearly, we don't want to publish anything that doesn't make sense or there's not an obvious explanation for. But nonetheless, I'm really very proud of all of the ambulance services that they've really moved on to say, hey, we're not afraid of having our figures compared, especially since we know you're going to be making every possible effort to compare apples with apples. And that's what I see as AUSROC striving very hard to do. We won't get it perfect, but we will be endeavouring to do that. And that's what Ben's doing now. We have a paper in draft that looks at the comparisons across ambulance services, and we're looking to double check that we've actually got good data capture from everywhere, that we are defining the outcomes appropriately and allowing the ambulance services to see those outcomes and the paper before we publish it. Our overall goal is to improve survival from out of hospital cardiac arrest. As we've seen from the Global Resuscitation Alliance, step one is to collect the data and analyse the data. Not just collect it. A lot of us collected data for a lot of years and it sat there. We need to be collecting it and using it. And hopefully by bringing together the common elements, we'll be able to identify both opportunities for improvement, but also opportunities for further research. We've had 2 publications to date. Happy to send you those if you don't have ready availability to it. We've described the different characteristics of ambulance services contributing to the Ausrock Epistry, and we've talked about the process. Interestingly, I get asked a lot of questions when I present internationally about the process, because that was a journey. And getting people's trust and buy-in, getting everybody happy that we weren't going to steal data from anybody, getting that trust and parameters around that trust in place has been a major journey, and I'm very pleased to say that we seem to have got there. Ben put this slide in, which is very nice because the other declaration is that Ian was my late husband, but this was always Ian's vision, to have an Australian-New Zealand epistry. I know that many of you will know that he used to go around and visit the various ambulance services and sort of try to promote this concept about having an Australian-New Zealand cardiac arrest registry. So I was very honoured to think that the Ausrock team would see that this is one of Ian's legacies. If you want to know more about Ausrock, we do have a website, and there's further information about the epistry up there. And we would all very much like to thank the ambulance services for their participation. It's them that are paying for the establishment of individual registries in their jurisdictions. Very important data, and we're very pleased to be working with them on this project. So thank you very much.